So the first technique we're going to be looking at is wrapping your florist wires with florist tape. And you'll see this in almost all of the makes in the Makealong. I'll start off each video by saying how many wires you need for the project, and they'll usually need to be wrapped with florist tape. And this just helps to give the stems a more natural finish and natural appearance. So the first thing to note about florist tape is that it doesn't appear to be very sticky at first, but it gets tacky as you stretch it and work with it. So that's the most important thing to bear in mind, is that you want to keep it stretched as you work with it on the wire, and that's going to help it to stick to itself and stop it becoming unraveled as you work with it. So I'm going to start with a 19 gauge wire, and I'll come onto a thinner wire in a moment and just talk a bit about that. But what you want to do as you work with the tape is to keep it at an angle. So I always like to keep it as close to the wire as I can. If you work at more of a 90-degree angle, you'll probably find it bunches up. It doesn't go on as smoothly and it may become unraveled. So by working at this lower angle and keeping it close to the wire, it will help you to stretch the tape as you work with it and get a really smooth finish. So I always start with overlapping the end of the wire with the tape. So I've released a good amount of tape from the roll, or you can always just cut the tape to about the same length as the wire, but I prefer to just keep it on the roll. And then once you've overlapped the end, what you want to do is to just pinch the tape and the wire together. So keep one hand on the rest of the tape, on the length of the tape below, and this is the hand that you're going to use to stretch the tape, which is going to make it tacky. And you want to keep the other hand at the top, and this is what you're going to twist and pinch the wire with. So start off by just twisting that wire at the top and the tape between your fingers. Don't worry if it looks a bit messy, we can trim that later, and just pull that up to the top of the wire, and you should find you get a little overhang at the top to keep it nice and neat. So you see I'm keeping a nice tight tension in the tape and keeping it close to the wire. And what I'm now going to do is pinch the top between my fingers, pull the bottom of the tape, and then use this top hand to twist the wire around, all the while keeping this tape tight. So I'm just working slowly, just moving down the wire, holding this bottom of the tape tight and twisting it with my top hand. And you can see it gets a really nice smooth coating of tape this way. So just keep working down the wire, stretch that tape. It can take quite a lot of stretching, so don't worry about breaking it, it should stretch. And just keep going, twisting until you reach the end, and then you can either just twist to break that tape at the end, or just use your scissors to cut near the end. So if you just check where the overhang is and then just snip the end, and then I'll go to the top and just snip the overhang there. So you'll see we've got a really nice smooth finish to the wire. And in most of the makes I'll just recommend using one layer of tape. In some of my projects I do add extra tape, and you can do that if you're making flowers with a thicker stem. That will just help to give a thicker appearance. Now when you're using thinner wire, so this is 22 gauge wire which we will be using, and we will be wrapping some of these with tape, it does become a little more tricky to get this going because the wire is thinner, so it's less easy to grip. But you want to just make sure it's exactly the same technique, but you'll find you just need to pinch a bit more tightly towards the end and just get that roll going. And you may find you get a little bit more creasing in the tape to begin with, but the technique is exactly the same. Just stretch and pull that tape down using this top hand to twist the wire and the bottom hand to guide the tape and keep it tight. Again, just all the way to the end. And then when you reach the end, you can just pull or trim that tape. And there you have it. So this is the technique we're going to be using a lot. So I really recommend, if you haven't wrapped florist wires with tape before, that you give this a good go before we start on the Makealong. And Another material we'll be using a lot of in the Makealong is binding wire, and this is a really thin, flexible paper covered wire, and you'll either be using it in green or brown depending on whether you're making the garland, wreath or bouquet. And this is a really useful wire for adding multiple items to stems. So if I show you this blossom stem, you can see each of these items has been assembled on some binding wire before we've attached it to the main wire. And we're going to be making things similar to this using binding wire and then using florist tape to attach them to the main stem. So in some of the Makealong projects, when we use binding wire, I'll tell you how many stems you need to cut and how we're going to use them, and then ordinarily we will wrap them onto a main florist wire stem using tape. And I recommend doing this by cutting a piece of tape that's around the same length as the main stem that you're wrapping the items onto. And then the usual technique I use is to tape the stem. Now this one's already wrapped in florist tape, so I've already got a layer of tape on here, but I'm then going to begin wrapping the stem again. So using exactly the same technique as we did before to wrap the stem. So pinching and twisting that tape. And then once you've got the first couple of centimetres on, what you can do is tuck one of those stems of binding wire underneath, and then use that tape to just secure the item on the stem. And then I'm going to wrap another one underneath, and the way that we assemble the stems will vary between the projects, but this is the general technique we'll be using. So wrapping the stem first with tape, then adding a second layer of tape into which we insert the binding wire stems. And then you can wrap the tape all the way to the end of the stem and trim. And then you'll see that these items are securely attached, and you can then manipulate and move them around the stem. So this technique will be covered in any video in the Makealong where we need to use it, but it's just a good idea to get familiar with the technique before we start the Makealong. Next, I just wanted to touch on glue guns. Now, you've probably already got your own glue gun that you're familiar with using, but if you are looking to get a new one, or you've just got a new one for the Makealong, then I thought it'd be just useful to share some tips on applying your glue when making felt flowers. So I like to use a glue gun with a fine tip nozzle. So if you haven't got a glue gun at the moment, or you're looking to get a new one, do look for one that has a fine tip nozzle. That will come in really handy with making your flowers. The one I use is a Tech 30512, a hot melt glue gun. And the main thing to say with using your glue gun for felt flowers is less is more. So you always want to apply less glue than you think you need. So it's a really good idea just in the next couple of weeks before we start the Makealong that you just get really used to using your glue gun if it is a new glue gun, and get used to just applying some really small dots of glue. So I would just recommend practicing on some felt or even just some scrap paper or cardboard. And you just want to practice making those really small dots of glue. So what I normally do is to just squeeze the trigger of the glue gun until you see that glue forming at the end. And then you can just dab it onto your felt. And then rather than pulling your glue gun straight away, just hover the glue gun over. And what you'll find is that just melts the glue strings. So you can see I've got a really neat dot of glue with no fine wispy strings. And I'm just going to press that over. So if I do that again, but this time pull my glue gun straight off the felt, you can see there's this real wispy string just forming. And when you've got lots of those on your work, it can get really frustrating trying to pull those off and melt them away at the end. So as I say, if you've got a new glue gun or you haven't used yours for a while, just get used to using it over the next couple of weeks before we start on part 1. Finally, for anyone who's new to the Makealong this year, I thought it'd be useful to quickly run through how you will receive each part of the Makealong from me. So each month throughout the Makealong, I will send out an email which will have a video tutorial talking you through all of the steps you need to make your flowers or your stems for that month. And at the end of the series, I also show you how to put everything together into your final display. Within each of those emails, you'll have a link to download your templates, as well as a list of all the tools and materials and all the felt colours you'll need for that month. The templates will always come to you with an A4 option and also a letter size option for my US makers. And within that template sheet, as well as all of the shapes to cut that month, you'll see a box that explains all of the shapes and how many to cut from which colours. Along with the template sheet, you'll see a cutting guide sheet, and the aim of this is just to make sure that you're using your felt efficiently and that you've got enough felt throughout the whole series to cut all of the pieces. So where you see just a plain box around the shapes, this is where we're using the colours for the first time in the series. But where you see a greyed out area at the top, this is where we will have used the colour already. So the remaining piece of felt is shown at the bottom with the shapes to cut that month. Finally, I will just link to a video up the top here which runs through some of my tips and techniques for cutting out your felt shapes, including ways to cut different types of shapes and how to handle your felt more easily when you're cutting out. But my number one tip, as always, is to make sure you're using a different pair of scissors for cutting out your paper templates, and then a separate pair that you keep just for cutting out your felt, and that will just help to prevent your felt cutting scissors becoming blunt. So that's all for my tips and tricks video. I will see you again in a few weeks for the first part of the 2025 Makealong. In the meantime, if you've got any questions about taking part or any of the techniques covered in this video, do let me know in the comments or drop me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon for part 1.